I don't know why I agreed to that trip. It was the middle of September, and my brother, Daniel, had this idea to take a long drive out to some remote cabin he had rented for a few days. He said it would be good for us to get out of the city, clear our heads. He'd been dealing with his divorce for the past 6 months, and for some reason, he thought it was a great idea to invite his ex-wife, Rebecca, along for the trip. I didn't ask questions. He framed it as some weird attempt at keeping things civil, like a way to move on. I wasn't in the mood to argue. My only condition was that I'd drive my own truck in case things got awkward and I needed to leave early. The place was far. I mean, really far. The roads turned to dirt about an hour before we even reached the so-called cabin. It was less of a cabin and more of an old hunting lodge. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, and a long wraparound porch that felt unstable under our boots. It was in the middle of nowhere. No other houses, no cars, nothing but trees and open land stretching for miles. No phone service either. The inside smelled like damp wood and dust. There were animal heads mounted on the walls, an old wood-burning stove in the corner, and furniture that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. The guy who rented it to Daniel told him it was fully stocked, which apparently meant there were some canned goods in the cupboard and a stack of old firewood out back. The first day was fine. We spent the evening outside, drinking a few beers, watching the sun go down. It got cold fast. By the time we went inside, the temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees. I slept in the back room, furthest from the front door. I figured I'd get the most privacy that way. I didn't know how things were between Daniel and Rebecca, and I didn't really want to find out. At some point in the night, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just this faint, rhythmic rustling, like footsteps moving through dry leaves. I ignored it. The wind had been blowing earlier, and I figured it was just branches shifting or animals moving around. But then, around an hour later, I heard it again. Same sound, slow, deliberate, like someone circling the cabin. I sat up in bed, listening. Stopped after a while, and I told myself I was just imagining things. The next morning, I went outside to take a leak and noticed something strange in the dirt. Footprints, big ones, not from any of us. I didn't say anything at first. I just walked around the cabin, looking for more. The ground was covered in dry leaves, but I could still make them out. They circled the cabin once, then led off toward the treeline. They were fresh. Rebecca came outside a few minutes later, wrapping her jacket tight around herself. She looked rough, like she hadn't slept much. "I heard something last night," she said, rubbing her arms. I didn't respond right away. I just glanced at the trees. Yeah, me too. Daniel came out soon after, and we all kind of just stood there, looking around. I finally pointed out the prints. We followed them a little way into the trees, but they just disappeared into the underbrush. Could have been a hunter. Could have been some local passing through. But why the hell would they be walking around our cabin in the middle of the night? We tried to shake it off, but the day felt off after that. Daniel and I went out to gather some firewood while Rebecca stayed behind. We didn't go far, but even just a few hundred yards into the trees, I started feeling uneasy. It was too quiet. No birds, no wind. Just that heavy, pressing silence that made my skin crawl. When we got back, Rebecca looked pale. She said she thought she saw something in the woods. A man just standing there watching. We asked her where, but when we looked, there was nothing. Just trees stretching on forever. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound put me on edge. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not just one person, more than one. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my window. I could hear breathing. Slow, heavy. I didn't move. Then I heard something worse. The doorknob rattled. I sat up, heart pounding. I reached for the hunting knife I had packed and waited. The door didn't open, but I heard them move around to the front of the cabin. A minute passed, then two. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the front door. I heard Daniel wake up in the next room, heard him moving fast. Another bang, then silence.
No retreating footsteps. No voices.
Just dead quiet. We stayed locked inside until morning. When we finally opened the door, we saw deep, heavy boot prints all over the porch. The firewood was scattered. One of the chairs had been knocked over. The worst part, there were handprints on the windows. Smudged, greasy prints, like someone had been pressing their face up against the glass. We packed up fast. We didn't even eat breakfast, just threw everything into the trucks and got the hell out of there. Daniel never mentioned going back. Neither did I. Rebecca didn't say much at all. As we got back to civilization, my phone finally got a signal. I checked the weather, checked my messages. Then, out of curiosity, I looked up the area where we had stayed. I found something that made my stomach drop. There had been disappearances out there. People gone without a trace. No signs of a struggle, no bodies ever found. Just missing. We never figured out who or what had been outside that cabin. And I don't want to. I had been with the department for over a decade by the time I got assigned to the case that still keeps me up at night. It was the kind of assignment no one wanted, rural patrol in an area so far from civilization that backup was nothing but a distant promise. The county covered hundreds of square miles, mostly flat farmland and stretches of dense forest, with a population so small you could go hours without seeing another car on the road. Most of the time, calls were the usual: domestic disturbances, bar fights, the occasional missing person who usually turned up drunk at a friend's house. But this one was different. Dispatch sent the call out late in the evening. A man had reported his neighbor missing. Normally, that wouldn't be too urgent, but in these rural parts, people looked out for each other. If someone said their neighbor was missing, it meant something wasn't right. The report came from a man named Richard Carter, who lived a good 20 miles off the main highway, surrounded by thick trees and dirt roads that barely passed for anything drivable. He said the missing man, Ben Thornton, hadn't been seen for 3 days. No one had seen him at the general store, he hadn't answered his radio, and his truck was still parked outside his house. I got into my cruiser and started the drive out. The further I went, the worse the roads got. What started as paved asphalt quickly turned to cracked dirt, then gravel, and then finally just 2 deep tire tracks cutting through the woods. Trees lined both sides of the road, so close that I had to slow down to avoid scraping the sides of the vehicle. It took nearly an hour to reach Ben's property. His house was small, just a single-story wooden place with a sagging porch and a rusted-out pickup parked in the dirt driveway. The house looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. Overgrown grass, a fence missing entire sections, and a barn that looked like it was one strong gust of wind away from collapsing. I stepped out of the cruiser, my boots crunching against the dirt. The place was silent. No sounds of animals, no wind through the trees. Just that eerie kind of quiet that settles in when something is wrong. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking. The inside of the house smelled stale, like dust and old wood. Dishes were piled up in the sink. The table had an open newspaper on it, dated 3 days ago. A cup of coffee sat next to it. The liquid inside evaporated down to a dark stain at the bottom. It was like Ben had just gotten up from breakfast one morning and never returned. I checked the back door. Locked. I checked the bedrooms. Bed made, dresser untouched. The only thing out of place was a hunting rifle leaning against the wall near the door, fully loaded. Out here, everyone owned guns, but no one left them out like that, not unless they expected to use them. I radioed in to report the situation. No signs of forced entry.
No struggle.
Just an empty house. Dispatch told me to check the property. I started with the barn. The doors were barely holding on, hanging loose on rusted hinges. Inside, there were tools scattered across the ground, a few old feed bags, and a workbench covered in dust. Nothing strange, no signs of Ben. That's when I noticed the path behind the barn, a narrow dirt trail leading into the woods, barely visible through the undergrowth. I followed it, moving slowly, scanning the ground for any tracks. The further I went, the darker it got. The trees were thick, their branches overhead blocking out the last bits of daylight. About half a mile in, I found something. A boot, old, worn, laces missing. It was lying in the dirt just off the path. I picked it up, turned it over. Inside, dried blood. Not fresh, but not old enough to be forgotten. I kept going, my pulse starting to quicken. The air felt different out here, heavier, like I was being watched. I had been in these woods before, plenty of times, but something about that night made every sound feel sharper, every movement in the trees stand out more than usual. Then I saw it, clearing just up ahead, a small patch of open land surrounded by trees, and in the middle of it, something unnatural, a hole. It was deep, at least 6 feet down, freshly dug, the dirt piled up beside it in a messy heap, and next to it something worse, a shovel, its blade still covered in dark, clumped up earth, and drag marks leading right up to the edge. I stepped closer, my hand hovering near my holster. The dirt smelled damp, fresh. I looked down into the hole. It was empty. Whatever had been there was gone. I scanned the area again, every nerve in my body on edge. The drag marks led away from the hole, back into the trees. Something had been buried here, and someone or something had come back to dig it up. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing, just trees stretching out in every direction. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves. I wasn't alone out there. I backed away from the hole, following the drag marks with my light. They led deeper into the woods, but I knew better than to keep going alone. I radioed in my location, my voice calm but firm. I needed backup. They told me to hold my position, but we both knew that meant I was on my own for at least another hour. I kept my gun drawn as I made my way back to the house. Every few steps, I stopped to listen. The woods felt alive around me, but I never saw anything. Never heard anything except my own breathing and the occasional rustle in the leaves. When I got back to the property, I checked the truck again. This time, I noticed something I had missed before. The driver's side door was unlocked, the inside a mess, papers scattered, the glove box hanging open. On the seat, a notebook, its pages flipped to the last entry. Something is out there, watching, coming closer every night. Last night, I heard it outside my window. I don't know what it is, but I think it wants me to go into the woods. I closed the notebook and stepped back. The front door to the house was open. I hadn't left it that way. I stood there, my pulse pounding. If Ben was dead, where was the body? If he had left, where had he gone? And more importantly, who had been inside that house while I was gone? Backup arrived an hour later, 2 other deputies. We searched the entire property. We followed the drag marks deeper into the woods, but they eventually disappeared. No tracks, no signs of movement, nothing. Ben Thornton was never found. His case remained open, officially labeled a missing persons case. Unofficially, we knew better. Something happened to him out there, something none of us could explain. I never went back to that property alone again. But sometimes, when I'm out on patrol, driving down those dark, empty roads, I get the feeling I'm not alone, that someone or something is still watching, waiting. I've been a company driver for the last 6 years. It's not a bad job, Long hours? Sure. But the pay's steady and I don't mind being out on the road alone. Some people hate the quiet. I like it. No one breathing down my neck. No office politics. Just me, my truck, and the road stretching ahead. That being said, not all routes are created equal. Some take you through the middle of nowhere, and those jobs always carry some level of risk. There's the usual stuff, breakdowns, bad weather, running low on gas, but sometimes it's the human element that's the real danger. This happened a couple of years back. The company sent me on a long haul, delivering equipment from Birmingham to a site way out in the Scottish Highlands. The kind of place where the road turns to gravel, then dirt, then just a suggestion of a path through the trees. I wasn't thrilled about it, but it was just another job. You don't say no when you've got bills to pay. I set out in the early afternoon, knowing I'd have to do the last stretch of the drive in the dark. The first few hours were uneventful, just highway driving, stopping for fuel and a bite to eat. But as I got further north, things changed. The roads got narrower, twisting through hills and forests, the kind where you wouldn't want to break down. No phone signal, no towns for miles. At some point, I turned onto the last road before my destination. Road is a generous term. It was a dirt track, full of potholes and barely wide enough for my truck. It was pitch dark now, and the only thing keeping me company was the hum of the engine and the beams of my headlights cutting through the trees. My ETA showed another 40 minutes, but I knew it would take longer. You can't rush on roads like this. One wrong move and you'll end up in a ditch. Then, about 20 minutes in, I saw something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just roadkill, maybe a deer or a badger. But as I got closer, I realized it was a car, a dark-colored sedan, half in the ditch, hazard lights blinking weakly. Normally, I wouldn't stop. I'm not a mechanic, and I'm not in the business of picking up strangers. But something about this felt wrong. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't seen another vehicle in hours. Maybe it was the way the front of the car was crumpled, like it had hit something head-on. I slowed down, scanning the trees on either side of the road. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. I kept driving. A few minutes later, my truck sputtered. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then the engine stuttered again. The dashboard lights flickered, and suddenly, the truck was dead. Just like that, in the middle of nowhere. I swore under my breath, trying the ignition. Nothing. My fuel gauge showed I had plenty of diesel. Battery was fine, at least last time I checked. I reached for my phone, no signal. Of course. I sat there for a minute, drumming my fingers against the steering wheel. My headlights were still on, casting a pale glow on the road ahead. The trees seemed closer now, pressing in from all sides. I tried to think logically. Maybe the rough road had shaken something loose. Maybe it was an electrical issue. Either way, I wasn't going anywhere until I figured it out. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel. The night air was cold, and so still it made my ears ring. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and popped the hood. The engine looked fine. Not that I knew what I was looking for. I checked the battery connections, the fuel lines, but everything seemed intact. Then, from somewhere in the trees, I heard a noise, a rustling sound, like someone stepping through the undergrowth. I froze, holding my breath. Another step, then nothing. I swept my flashlight across the trees, my heart pounding. Could have been an animal. Fox, a badger, maybe a deer, or maybe it wasn't. I shut the hood, locked the doors, and got back inside the truck. I wasn't going to stand out there in the open like an idiot. For a while, nothing happened. I sat in the cab, engine dead, fingers tapping against my knee. I kept checking my phone, but the signal never came back. Then, just as I was about to try the ignition again, I saw movement in my mirror. Something, a shape, crossing the road behind my truck. My breath caught. It was too dark to make out details, But I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I sat completely still, barely breathing. The figure disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. I waited, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I reached for the key and tried the ignition. The truck roared to life like nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't question it. I slammed it into gear and took off down the road, my headlights bouncing wildly over the uneven ground. I didn't care if I wrecked my suspension. I just wanted to get out of there. I drove for another 15 minutes before I saw lights. Real lights, not the reflection of my own. A security post, marking the entrance to the work site. I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath until I pulled up next to the guard shack. The guy inside stepped out, waving me forward. "You made it," he said, giving me a look. "We were starting to get worried. You were supposed to be here an hour ago." I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. I was late, but not by an hour, only by a few minutes. The guy must have seen something in my face because he frowned. "You all right?" I hesitated. Then I just nodded. I wasn't about to explain what had happened. Not because I didn't think he'd believe me, but because I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. I finished the drop-off and took a different route back. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was just some lost hiker or some local messing around in the woods. But I never figured out why my truck died. Why it suddenly came back to life the moment that figure disappeared. I don't think I want to know. All I know is this: I don't take jobs that send me into the middle of nowhere anymore. And I never, ever stop for stranded cars. I was heading west, chasing the last bit of daylight before the sky swallowed it up completely. It was late autumn, maybe early winter, and the sun had dipped low enough that everything had that dull grayish hue, the kind that made the landscape feel lifeless. I had been driving for hours, too many hours, my body stiff from sitting in the driver's seat. The road I was on was the kind you only find on old maps, a thin, cracked line cutting through nothingness. No houses, no gas stations, no signs of life except the occasional rusted-out car carcass abandoned on the shoulder. I had taken this road because I thought it would be faster, a shortcut through the backcountry, but I had underestimated just how desolate it was. My phone had lost signal miles back. Not that it mattered. I hadn't seen another car for nearly an hour. I had left a small town early that morning, planning to reach another by nightfall, but things hadn't gone as planned. Roadwork had forced a detour, then another, and now I was on this forgotten stretch of road, the kind that felt like it shouldn't even exist anymore. My gas gauge hovered just above empty. I hadn't passed a gas station in who knows how long. If I didn't find one soon, I'd be walking. The temperature was dropping fast, and even with the heater on, I could feel the cold creeping in from the outside. The sky was dark now, and I flicked on my high beams, lighting up the cracked pavement ahead. The trees on either side of the road loomed tall and skeletal, their bare branches reaching out like fingers. Then I saw it, something on the side of the road. At first, it was just a shape, a dark smudge against the lighter pavement. As I got closer, my headlights swept over it, and I saw it was a car, an old sedan, maybe from the 90s, sitting just off the road, tilted slightly as if one tire had gone flat or sunk into the dirt. I slowed down. The car was empty. The driver's side door was open. There was no movement, no sign of anyone nearby. I pulled over a few feet ahead of it, my engine idling as I debated whether or not to get out. Everything about it felt wrong. If someone had broken down, they should still be here or at least have left something behind. Hazard lights flashing, a note on the dashboard, something. But there was nothing. I sat there for a long moment, fingers tapping against the steering wheel. I told myself I should just keep going, that stopping on a road like this, at this time of night, was a bad idea. But then I noticed something else. The footprints. In the dirt beside the car, I could see them. A set of footprints leading away from the open driver's side door and disappearing into the trees. A bad feeling settled in my gut. Someone had left this car recently, and they had gone into the woods. I turned my high beams toward the trees, but they only illuminated a small section, just enough to make the shadows look deeper. I could barely make out the start of a narrow path leading into the forest, the kind made by deer or other animals, not people. I looked back at the footprints. Then I saw the second set. Smaller, lighter, not just one person, two. A sharp chill ran through me, but I didn't move. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, eyes flicking between the empty car, the footprints, and the darkness of the woods. Something was wrong. Everything in me screamed to drive away. But then I saw movement, not in the woods, in my rearview mirror, a shape just for a second. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing, just the road, the darkness, and the car sitting motionless beside me. My heart hammered against my ribs. I put the car into drive, ready to leave. Then a sound, not from the woods, not from the road, from my back seat, a rustling, a shift of weight, like someone moving. I didn't think. I reacted. I slammed my foot on the gas, tires kicking up dirt as I shot forward. My heart was in my throat, my mind screaming at me to look in the mirror, but I couldn't. The road was rough, full of cracks and potholes, and I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. My mind raced through every possibility. Had someone slipped into my car while I had been staring at the abandoned one? Had they been there the whole time? I kept driving. Fast. Too fast. Then a sound. Not a rustle this time. Breathing. Slow. Deliberate. Right behind me. I felt a pressure in my chest, like my lungs wouldn't work right. I knew I had to look. I flicked my eyes up to the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw something. A face, pale and wide-eyed, staring right at me from the darkness of my back seat. I swerved. Hard. The car skidded, tires screaming, and I barely managed to keep control. Then the door opened. Not mine. The back door. Someone tumbled out. I didn't stop. I drove. Fast. I didn't know how far. Didn't care. I just drove. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw lights in the distance. A gas station. A small one, but a gas station nonetheless. I pulled in, shaking so bad I could barely grip the wheel. I turned. The back seat was empty. The door was closed. Had I imagined it? Had I hit something on the road and my mind had twisted it into something worse? No, because when I got out of the car, when I forced myself to check, I saw it. The dirt on the back seat, and the small handprint smeared on the inside of the window. I never took that road again. I don't think I ever will. I had always been careful about long drives at night. There was something about the dark, empty roads stretching for miles, the quiet hum of the engine, and the occasional flickering of headlights against the trees that unsettled me. It wasn't fear. At least, not the kind that made my hands shake or my heart race, but more of an unease that sat deep in my gut. That night, I was on a stretch of road somewhere in Wyoming. It was a 2-lane highway, the kind where you could drive for miles without seeing another car. I had left Boise earlier that afternoon, trying to make good time on my way to Cheyenne. The plan had been to stop somewhere along the way, maybe get a cheap motel room for a few hours before finishing the drive in the morning. But as the sun went down, I realized there wasn't much in the way of civilization out here. The gas station I had stopped at back in Riverton had been the last real sign of life. A single clerk behind the counter, an old guy with a face like worn leather, had given me a glance as I filled up my tank and grabbed a couple of energy drinks. He hadn't said much, just nodded as I handed him a 20. When I asked how far the next town was, he'd simply said, "Long ways," before looking back down at the magazine in his hands. By the time I had driven another couple of hours, I still hadn't passed another town. The road signs had been sparse, most of them half-rusted or leaning at odd angles. My GPS was no help. It had lost signal about 40 minutes ago. I wasn't too worried. I had a full tank, and worst case, I could pull over and sleep in the truck for a few hours before moving on. But then I saw the turnoff. It wasn't much, just a small dirt road branching off the highway, barely visible in the weak glow of my headlights. There was an old wooden sign at the entrance, the lettering so faded I couldn't make out what it once said. Maybe it was the name of an old town or a ranch. Either way, it wasn't on my GPS, and that made me curious. I slowed down. The highway stretched ahead, empty and dark. There hadn't been a road sign in a while, and I was starting to think I had missed a turn somewhere. I figured this road had to lead somewhere, maybe to a small town or at least a place where I could get my bearings. I took the turn. As soon as I did, I felt an odd sensation in my gut. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a small twist, like when you realize you might have made a mistake but can't quite put your finger on why. The road was narrow, just wide enough for one vehicle. The dirt was dry and loose, kicking up dust in my rearview mirror as I drove. The trees pressed in close on both sides, thick and gnarled, their branches stretching over the road like skeletal fingers. I drove for about 15 minutes. There were no houses, no streetlights, not even another sign. The road just kept going, winding deeper into the trees. The further I went, the worse the road got. Potholes, uneven patches of dirt, rocks scattered across the path. It was clear this road hadn't been maintained in years. I should have turned around, but I didn't. It wasn't stubbornness exactly, more like a feeling that I had already come this far, so I might as well see where it led. Then I saw the truck. It was an old, beat-up Ford sitting off to the side of the road, partially hidden by the trees. The headlights were off, and it didn't look like it had been moved in a long time. The windows were dark, the windshield covered in a thin layer of dust. I slowed down, my own headlights illuminating the side of the truck. There were deep scratches in the metal, long, jagged marks that ran from the driver's side door all the way to the tailgate. It wasn't the kind of damage you'd get from a crash. It looked more like something had clawed at it. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I kept going. Another 5 minutes passed, and the road only got worse. The trees grew thicker, the branches lower. They scraped against the top of my truck, making a sound that sent a shiver through me. I checked my phone again, still no signal. Then, my headlights caught something ahead. Another vehicle. This one was older, maybe from the 70s, its body rusted and half buried in the undergrowth. The windows were shattered, the tires long since deflated. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, and yet the dirt around it was disturbed. Someone had been here recently. I felt my chest tighten. Something wasn't right. I slowed to a crawl, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to get the hell out of there. Then I saw the footprints. They were fresh. The dirt around the old car was covered in them. Boot prints, large and deep, leading away from the wreck and disappearing into the trees. I stopped the truck. I sat there, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The night was dead silent. Not even the sound of crickets or wind through the trees. Just silence. Then, in my rearview mirror, I saw movement. A shadow, shifting just beyond the reach of my taillights. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I slammed the truck into reverse, tires spinning in the loose dirt. The engine roared as I backed up, nearly hitting the old car in my hurry to turn around. The branches scraped against my truck again, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. Then, something ran across the road in front of me. It was fast, too fast. I barely caught a glimpse of it, just a blur of movement, something tall and thin, moving on two legs but not quite right. It disappeared into the trees before my headlights could fully illuminate it. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove. The road seemed longer on the way back, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember. The trees loomed even closer, their branches reaching out like they wanted to pull me in. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see something behind me, but there was nothing. By the time I hit the highway again, I was shaking. I didn't stop driving. I didn't even look back. It wasn't until I reached the next town, almost 2 hours later, that I finally pulled over. I sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. I never figured out what I saw that night, and I never went back to find out. I had always been the kind of person who liked solitude. Something about being alone in the wilderness made me feel grounded, away from the noise of everyday life. That's why, when I got a week off from work, I decided to take a solo trip deep into the backcountry. The plan was simple. I packed my truck with enough supplies to last me at least 10 days: food, water, fuel, spare tires, an emergency beacon, a rifle, and a handgun just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I liked being prepared. The area I chose was a stretch of remote wilderness in the northern part of the country, miles away from any town or paved road. No cell service, no people, just endless forest, rocky terrain, and a few abandoned logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The drive out was peaceful. I spent hours watching the landscape shift from small towns and farmland to thick forests and rolling hills. Eventually, I turned onto an old logging road, my truck bouncing over potholes and loose gravel. The deeper I went, the more I could tell that no one had been out there in a long time. Grass had grown up in the middle of the road, tree branches hung low enough to scrape the top of my truck, and the only tire tracks were my own. After about an hour of slow, careful driving, I found a spot that seemed perfect, an open clearing near a small river, surrounded by dense trees. The sky had started to darken, and I knew I needed to set up camp before it got too late. I pulled my truck into the clearing, killed the engine, and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp and cool, and the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the distant rush of water. I set up my tent a few feet away from my truck, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. As night fell, the forest around me seemed to come alive with the sounds of nocturnal animals. Owls hooted somewhere in the distance, and I could hear the occasional rustling of small creatures moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful. The first night passed without incident. I slept well, waking only once when I thought I heard something moving near my truck. I listened for a few minutes, my hand resting on my rifle, but when I heard nothing else, I eventually went back to sleep. The next morning, I spent some time exploring the area, hiking along the river and scouting for good fishing spots. I found an old, overgrown path that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Curiosity got the best of me, and I followed it for a while. It wound through the trees, leading deeper into the forest. After about an hour, I came across something unexpected. A small, rundown cabin, half hidden by the overgrowth. It didn't look like anyone had lived in it for years. The wood was weathered and rotting, the windows were broken, and the door hung slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. My instinct told me to turn back, but I ignored it. I peered inside and saw nothing but old furniture covered in dust, a collapsed roof in one corner, and what looked like animal droppings scattered across the floor. Just an old, abandoned hunting cabin, I told myself. Nothing unusual. Still, something about the place unsettled me. Maybe it was how silent it was. No birds, no insects, just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I backed away and made my way back to camp, shaking off the unease. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. I told myself it was just an old building, nothing more, but something about it felt wrong. I forced myself to focus on other things. I cleaned my rifle, double-checked my gear, and eventually crawled into my tent, listening to the crackling of the fire outside. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the night was silent. I lay still, my ears straining for any sound. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving just outside my tent. My heart pounded. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tightly as I lay there, not moving. The footsteps circled my tent once, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. Minutes passed, and I heard nothing else. Just the wind through the trees. I stayed awake until dawn, rifle in my lap, listening for any sound. When the sun finally rose, I cautiously stepped out of my tent. The clearing looked exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. There were footprints in the dirt, circling my tent. Not animal tracks, human. I scanned the tree-line, rifle raised, but saw nothing. Whoever had been there was gone. I told myself it had to be a hunter or a hiker, but deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I was miles from any trail, and I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. Still, I tried to shake it off. I went about my day as usual, but I couldn't stop checking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. That night, I barely slept. Every sound had me gripping my rifle, heart pounding. But nothing happened. The next morning, I made a decision. I was cutting my trip short. I packed up quickly, shoving everything into the back of my truck. As I was loading the last of my gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Near the edge of the clearing, just where the trees started, there was a shape, pile of something. I approached slowly, my rifle raised. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The body had been torn apart, its ribcage cracked open, but that wasn't what scared me. What scared me was how fresh it was. It hadn't been there the night before. Someone had put it there. I didn't stick around to find out who. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and tore out of there as fast as the old logging road would let me. Even hours later, when I was finally back on paved roads, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I don't know who or what was out there with me, but I know one thing: I won't be going back. I was deep in the woods, far from any road or town, on a hunting trip that I had been looking forward to for months. It was late November, the air crisp and cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones if you stay still too long. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, thick with pines and bare-limbed oaks, the ground carpeted in fallen leaves and patches of frost. I had parked my truck on an old logging trail, hiked in a good 3 miles, and set up a small camp near a narrow creek. This was supposed to be my time to clear my head, to enjoy the quiet and the challenge of tracking deer in this remote area. I had a bolt-action rifle, a good pack with enough supplies to last me a few days, and a solid plan. The first morning went by without much activity. I found tracks, fresh ones, but the wind wasn't in my favor. By afternoon, I had moved deeper into the forest, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of movement. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I decided to head back to camp before it got too dark. That's when I found the tracks. They weren't deer tracks. At first, I thought maybe they belonged to another hunter, but the size was off. Too wide, too long, and the stride was strange. Almost as if whoever made them wasn't walking naturally. The tracks weaved through the undergrowth, cutting across the game trail I had been following. My first thought was a bear, but they didn't quite match that either. I crouched down, running my fingers along the indentations in the soil. They looked fresh, maybe an hour old at most. Something about them put me on edge. I stood up, scanning the woods around me. The trees stood still, the wind barely whispering through the branches. Everything felt too quiet. I kept moving. I wasn't going to let some tracks spook me. I had been hunting since I was a kid. I knew these woods, and I knew how easy it was to let your imagination get the best of you. Back at camp, I started a fire, cooked up some Ken stew, and tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a misinterpretation of some ordinary animal's tracks. But as the night stretched on, that feeling didn't go away. Something was out there, watching. I kept my rifle close as I settled into my tent. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and every little sound outside made me tense up. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual noises of the forest at night. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A branch snapped, not the small, light crack of a twig under a rabbit's foot. No, this was heavier, deliberate. Something was moving nearby. I sat up, gripping my rifle. The fire had died down, leaving only embers, and the darkness outside pressed against the thin fabric of my tent. My breath felt too loud. I strained my ears, listening. Then silence. For a long time, nothing happened. I didn't dare move. I sat there in the dark, rifle in my lap, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I stepped outside, stretching, my breath visible in the cold air. Everything looked normal. My camp was undisturbed. Maybe I had imagined it. Then I saw the tracks. They were closer to my camp now. Whatever had made them had circled me in the night. My gut tightened. I wasn't dealing with a deer or a bear. This was something else. Something that was watching me. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it was. I'd had enough. I started back toward my truck, moving at a steady pace, keeping my rifle ready. The tracks followed my path for a while before veering off. I didn't stop to investigate. The whole hike back, I felt like I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear something, distant footsteps, the rustle of branches. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear into the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I wasted no time getting out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw something standing at the tree line, tall, still, watching. Then it was gone. I never went back to that part of the woods again.